In this video, I'm going to show you how to write augmented and diminished intervals. So you already know how to write perfect intervals, and you already know how to write major and minor intervals. These are the last two qualities that we're going to be learning, and so I'm going to show you how to do that. So in order to get to these intervals, we're always going to start with either a major or a perfect interval. This makes sense because these are the ones that we get from our major scale. So this is the easiest way to start. So let's go ahead and talk about how this works a little bit. So I'm going to start by drawing a little bit of a diagram for you, and then we'll go ahead into notation. But so if we talk about major and minor intervals, we have this kind of relationship. So here we have a major interval. If a major interval is made a half step smaller, it becomes minor. We could do that. Okay, and same thing if you start with a minor interval and you make it a half step bigger, you get a major interval. Okay, so that works. But what happens if you make a minor interval a half step smaller still? Well, that's when you end up with a diminished interval. Now, there are two ways to label a diminished interval. You sometimes see a lowercase d, but that can get confusing because sometimes you're also working with the note D or in the key D, and so I will prefer to use this other symbol. It looks like a degree sign. So either of those will be things that you'll see that are a way to show that you have a diminished interval. So let's go ahead and talk about how that can work. Let's be in bass clef for a bit. And let's go ahead and talk about a sixth. So I'm going to start with A, and I'm going to write a major sixth above A. First thing to do is to count up a sixth. So I'm going to start with A and count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's an F of some sort. To determine what kind of F, I'm going to ask myself about the A major scale, right? The A major scale, because A is the bottom note. So in the A major scale, what is my key signature? Well, I have 3 sharps. I have F sharp. Oh, F sharp. Good. That's the note I have. So I don't even have to go any further than that. I'm going to put a sharp on that F. And now this is a major sixth because the top note is in the major scale of my bottom note. So let's say I wanted to take that and I wanted to make that a diminished sixth above A instead of a major sixth. Well, the first thing I have to do is pass it through the minor first, right? I can't go directly from major to diminished. So I'm going to take a major interval. I'm going to make it a half step smaller, and we're going to get to minor. That's our next step. So if I keep the A the same, I'm going to get a half step smaller by bringing my top note down. That makes the interval closer together. So I'll start with an A on the bottom, and then I'll take my F sharp and I'll move it a half step down to an F natural. I'm showing the natural sign there just for clarification, but I could have just written the F by itself and it would still be fine. So this is a minor sixth. I'm going to label that. So now if I want to get to a diminished sixth, I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to keep the A the same, and I'm going to move that F down a half step. Now I know what you might be thinking. F down a half step is E, yeah? But what if I write A to E? Is that still a sixth? that can't be any kind of sixth because it doesn't have six. It's not a sixth interval. Like I would only count up 5 to get from A to E. So that's a kind of fifth. So it might sound the same, but it's not the same. A to E can never be any kind of sixth. So I still need to keep my top note some kind of F. That's how we get the sixth. But I'm going to need to make my F a half step lower than an F natural in order to make it diminished. So what's going to end up happening is I'm going to have an F flat. That is my diminished sixth, and I'm going to show it like this. The little degree sign before the sixth. So that's how you get to a diminished interval. It's actually pretty simple. You just have to go another step past the minor. Okay? So if you saw an A and the directions said, write a diminished sixth above this A, you would go through step by step like I just did. You would first write a major sixth, then a minor sixth, then a diminished sixth. Now, you can also get to diminished intervals from a perfect interval. And this process is very, very similar. But remember that perfect intervals can never be major and they can never be minor. So if you make a perfect interval smaller, you're not going to get a minor interval. That can never happen. So perfect kind of is like this. Kind of in between where major and minor are because it kind of substitutes for both. And if you make a perfect interval a half step smaller, you just get diminished. You go straight to diminished. You bypass minor altogether. So it's even simpler when you have a perfect interval. So let's say I want to write a diminished fourth above G. First, I'm going to write my G. Then I'm going to count up 4. G, A, B, C. You find perfect intervals in the same way that you find major intervals. So, let's label 4 so don't forget. There we go. Okay. So, is C in the major scale of G? Or another way to say it is, what kind of C is in the major scale of G? Well, we know G has one sharp. That sharp is F sharp. So it does not affect the C. So C natural is in the G major scale. So what I have already is a perfect fourth. But what I'm trying to get to is a diminished fourth. So let's keep the G the same and let's adjust that top note. I'm going to bring the C down a half step. That's going to make that interval smaller. And remember, I have to keep it some kind of C. So it's going to end up being a C flat. And that's my diminished fourth, and that's all there is to it. All right, so that's diminished. Augmented is a very similar process, only augmented is actually bigger than major and bigger than perfect. So if you have a major interval and you go one half step bigger, you get augmented. Augmented is sometimes denoted with a capital A. But again, that can be confusing when you're talking about the note A or the scale A or the key A. So another way to show it is with a little plus sign. And that's how I'll probably continue to use it in these videos. So let's do treble clef for a second. Let's say I want to write an augmented second above B flat. Well, I know that a second is some kind of C. I'm going to start with a major second. So what kind of C is in the key of B flat major? Well, B flat has two flats, B flat and E flat. Neither of those affects the note C, so I'm good like I am here, C natural. So this is a major second. In order to get to augmented, I'm going to take major and I'm going to make it a 1/2 step bigger. Let's keep the B flat where it is. How will I make that interval bigger? Well, think about moving the top note up. That'll give more space between the notes. I have to keep it at some kind of C, so I'm going to go from B flat to C sharp. And here's like a little bonus notation lesson. This is kind of difficult to manage when you have a harmonic second like this, where the notes are played at the same time. Of course, you write them a little bit off-centered because otherwise they would overlap and just look like a big mushy ball. So we're going to do it that way, but then the question becomes, like, how do you write all your accidentals in the right places, right? Because you have to be very precise about the line or space. So what you do is you just kind of also stagger the accidentals before the intervals. So something like this. Like that works just fine because the flat still is very clearly on the B and the sharp is very clearly on the C. This is one reason why it's so important to be precise, because if I somehow got those mixed up, it would become a different interval. You know, if I thought it was a B flat or a B sharp instead of a B flat, like that would really screw up what I was trying to do here. But a B flat to a C sharp is an augmented second. And that's how I'll label that. If you make a perfect interval a 1/2 step bigger, you also get augmented. So I could do an augmented octave. Those are kind of fun. Let's do that. So let's do an augmented octave above E. I'm going to start off with a perfect octave, a P8. So I'm just going to go up to my other E. To get to augmented, I'm going to make this perfect interval 1/2 step bigger. So that means I'm going to move the top note up a 1/2 step, but it has to stay in E for it to still be an 8 interval. So there's an E to an E sharp. And that's how I'll show that, is an augmented octave, we sometimes say, or an augmented 8th. That's how that works, E to E sharp. But that E sharp is also an octave above. That's something you don't see all the time, but it does happen in music, and it's kind of interesting. It has a very clashy sound to it, but can really have a very specific effect. So that's how you do that. Now, one other thing I want to mention, we've been given the bottom note and writing them above. Eventually, we'll talk about how to write intervals below a note. It just is a little bit of an extra step in the process. But just so you know, if we were going to adjust the bottom note, remember to make something bigger, we're thinking about space. We're not thinking about direction. So we could have taken, for example, this perfect fourth to make this a 1/2 step smaller. We could have moved the bottom note up a 1/2 step. Or to make this a 1/2 step bigger, we could have moved the bottom note down a 1/2 step. So those are still ways to do intervals, but it just depends on, which note you need to keep constant and which note you need to move. But you will sometimes need to move the bottom note, and that's how you think about that. This has been a video about writing augmented and diminished intervals. Make sure that you know this chart at the top very well. And it looks kind of messy, but you get the idea. Major intervals, a 1/2 step smaller or minor, a 1/2 step smaller still or diminished. Major intervals, a 1/2 step bigger or augmented. Perfect intervals, a 1/2 step smaller become diminished. Perfect intervals, a 1/2 step bigger become augmented. There are more. You can go even more 1/2 steps bigger and smaller, but we're not going to concern ourselves with that in this class. It doesn't happen very often in music, so I'm not too concerned about you knowing to do it. It's more of just a theoretical idea. But just so you know that that exists. All right. If you have any questions, as always, you can email me. I will talk to you soon.